So Donald Trump just seized the one sovereign leader he thought he could bully without consequence. And for the first time in his political life, he blinked. But here's the thing. The damage is already done. We are watching the complete collapse of a strongman gamble dressed up as decisive leadership that was doomed from the start. The White House operated on the arrogant assumption that the world would freeze, hesitate, and quietly accept the new reality. They banked everything on the idea that fear alone would force international institutions to fold and move on. But guess what? That gamble has backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. Instead of submission, Trump has been met with a wall of cold, hard competence. And it has exposed his operation as chaotic, unprepared, and completely out of its depth. It's honestly hard to believe he thought this would work. We are talking about a core principle of sovereignty, not a disposable pawn in one man's ego trip. This isn't just about one headline or one country. We are talking about the United States proving to the world that its word no longer means anything. Let me fill you in on what's been happening. So let's look at the setup here. Donald Trump returned to power carrying resentment instead of preparation, convinced that confrontation itself was proof of strength. He didn't come back patient. He didn't come back careful. He came back restless, angry, and obsessed with showing the first still meant obedience from everyone else. That emotional urgency shaped every move that followed. Trump did not have new intelligence that justified escalation. Trump did not have a layered plan for containment, diplomacy, or exit. Trump had a grievance and a craving for domination, and he treated the global stage as if it were still a reality TV set built for shock value rather than consequence. He needed an enemy that could be framed instantly. He needed a target that could be punished loudly without the friction of Congress or prolonged debate. Venezuela was selected not because it suddenly crossed a new line, but because it was already coded as disposable in American political messaging, already familiar to his base, already easy to turn into a symbol. Whether it was trade threats against long-standing allies or tariff ultimatums sold as patriotism or public humiliation of institutions that refused to bend, the pattern never changed. Threat first. Submission demanded next. Celebration only after the spectacle was complete. But this time, the assumption collapsed. They knew he would return. They knew he would escalate. And they built a response designed not to match his chaos, but to absorb it with dull, disciplined stability. Trump pushed forward, expecting panic. He expected emergency calls, frantic negotiations, and quiet concessions behind closed doors. He expected institutions to hesitate, allies to argue among themselves, and the world to slowly adjust to whatever new boundary he decided to erase. That didn't happen. Instead of emotional outrage, the response was procedural. Instead of ideological shouting, it was legal language. Governments didn't debate Trump's personality. They spoke about sovereignty. They spoke about precedent. They spoke about what happens when a single country decides that force replaces rules. International bodies didn't fracture under pressure. They aligned around the same concern, expressed in different accents but with the same meaning. This was not about sympathy for a regime. This was about whether any leader could be seized once power was deemed sufficient. And while Trump sold the move as decisive strength, the consequences landed elsewhere. American workers felt uncertainty creep back into supply chains. Businesses paused investments, not out of protest, but out of fear that instability was being normalized. Job security became a question mark again, not because of foreign retaliation, but because volatility had become policy. The gap between the slogan and reality widened quietly. Trump framed dominance. The system responded with resistance, and the people caught in between were never part of the calculation. That is the setup. At first glance, this looks like just another clash of personalities. But if you zoom out, a very specific pattern snaps into focus. The first response came wrapped in loyalty. Officials, allies, and institutional figures stepped forward believing they could manage Trump, soften his instincts, and protect the system by absorbing his pressure quietly. They defended him in public, translated his impulses into policy language, and assumed restraint would be rewarded. The line appeared when Trump demanded something that could not be done without crossing legal or moral boundaries. Not a compromise, not a delay, A single act that would have required someone else to break the rules so he wouldn't have to. Trump did not accept that limit. He turned instantly, publicly, and without hesitation. The defender became the obstacle, the loyal figure became the enemy, and the attack was swift, personal, and humiliating. The message was clear. Loyalty to Trump supersedes loyalty to the law. Once you see this pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. Anyone who refuses to cross the line is disposable. And that is the rule governing power inside Trump's world. It happened again, this time on a larger stage. Institutions entered the moment believing that established norms would hold, that precedent and procedure would slow the escalation. They approached with caution, respect, and the assumption that boundaries still mattered. The boundary emerged when Trump pushed beyond what the system could absorb. He demanded acceptance of an act that rewrote sovereign limits by force. The refusal was calm, procedural, and rooted in principle. Trump responded with destruction. He dismissed restraint as weakness, framed resistance as betrayal, and turned institutional disagreement into political combat. The narrative flipped instantly, and the system itself was cast as the problem. The message was clear. Loyalty to Trump supersedes loyalty to the law. And then it happened again, this time globally. Governments reacted not with outrage, but with alignment, believing coordination could contain the damage. They spoke in measured tones, referenced international norms, and signaled unity through process rather than spectacle. The boundary appeared when Trump expected silence and compliance, when he assumed fear would replace rules and speed would replace legitimacy. The refusal came not as protest, but as collective resistance anchored in precedent. Trump escalated rhetorically and politically. He framed coordination as conspiracy, legality as obstruction, and stability as cowardice. The machinery of pressure revved up again, aimed at breaking hesitation through intimidation. The message was clear. Loyalty to Trump supersedes loyalty to the law. This is not improvisation. This is not chaos without logic. It is a consistent method of power that rewards obedience and punishes limits. Each time the setting changes, each time the players rotate, but the rule remains intact. Those who protect Trump are useful only until they refuse him. Those who uphold boundaries become targets the moment they matter. And the cost of resistance is never private. It is always public. Once you recognize this pattern, it reshapes everything that follows. The arrest is no longer an isolated event. The outrage is no longer emotional noise. It becomes a warning signal, not about one country, not about one leader, but about a system where power no longer tolerates restraint and where the law survives only if someone is willing to be destroyed for it. The sickest inversion in this entire mess is how fast Donald Trump flips the moral roles. A sovereign state becomes the problem because it won't submit. International law becomes weakness because it won't move at the speed of Trump's ego. And the moment anyone says, no, you can't do that, Trump doesn't argue the substance. He weaponizes the refusal. Suddenly, the people defending rules are framed as the enemy, and the people breaking them are framed as the patriots. That's the core corruption here. One side is trying to operate inside a framework of limits, procedure, legitimacy, restraint. The other side treats limits as vandalism targets. If the rules produce an outcome Trump dislikes, he doesn't negotiate inside the rules, he attacks the rules. And what makes it worse is that these are the same rules the United States spent decades insisting everyone else follow. Now, Trump is basically saying, those rules were for you, not for me. And the reaction isn't abstract. It hits immediately because markets and voters don't run on slogans. They run on predictability. When a superpower starts acting like the law is optional, the first instinct is not celebration. It's freeze. It's caution. It's people pulling their hands back from the table. Companies don't like uncertainty. Allies don't like unpredictability. Voters don't like chaos. Think about that. The moment Trump tries to sell strength, the world reads instability. And the first thing that disappears is confidence, which brings us to Trump's most fragile asset, the brand. Donald Trump's political identity depends on one image, the economic strongman who can bully outcomes into existence. But this kind of move doesn't project control. It projects risk. It tells every serious actor, business, diplomacy, institutions that Trump is willing to light matches near gasoline just to prove he's still holding the match. And once that perception sets in, every future threat becomes weaker because the threat stops sounding like leverage and starts sounding like recklessness. And now Trump is trapped in a no-win box that he built with his own hands. If Trump escalates, the economic and political damage spreads. Donors get nervous, businesses pause, allies harden, voters feel the instability in their daily lives. The cost doesn't stay offshore. It comes home and it starts burning the very coalition Trump needs to survive. If Trump retreats, he loses the one thing he sells to his base: dominance. He looks like a bluff that got called. He looks like a strongman fantasy meeting a real wall. And Trump's base does not reward retreat. They punish it. So he can't win clean. He can only choose which kind of loss to wear. And that's where the Republican Party starts splitting in real time. The business wing wants predictability. The MAGA base wants spectacle. The moderates want to survive the next election cycle without being dragged into a permanent crisis. They all want different outcomes, and Trump's move forces them to pick a side without giving them a safe exit. Some will defend the action because they fear the base. Some will distance themselves because they fear the fallout. Some will go silent because they fear both. And the result is not unity, it's paralysis. Everyone watching the same fire, arguing over whether to call it strength or disaster, while the system keeps heating up. This is the moment where the story stops being about politics and turns into an institutional test. Because once Donald Trump crossed the line of seizing a sitting head of state, the system had no choice but to respond. Not emotionally, not rhetorically, structurally. A formal institution stepped into the frame, and that alone changed everything. This was no longer cable news noise or partisan theater. It became a question of whether the architecture that restrains presidential power still functions when a president decides it shouldn't. The suspicion wasn't subtle. Trump was once again leaning on the broad language of executive authority, flirting with the idea that urgency, security, or necessity could replace consent. Congress wasn't consulted. Deliberation wasn't invited. The move carried the unmistakable scent of an executive daring the system to stop him. And here's where Trump miscalculated. Courts usually avoid the words national security like a minefield. They defer, they hesitate, they slow walk. But when the justification stretches past recognition, when the reasoning sounds more like assertion than law, deference evaporates. And that matters, because the moment courts stop stepping aside, the illusion of unchecked authority collapses. What followed wasn't outrage, it was distance. Legal language replaced talking points. Procedure replaced performance, and the louder Trump tried to frame resistance as sabotage, the clearer it became that something deeper was happening. Even conservative voices began to shift, not the bomb throwers, not the loudest loyalists, but the institutional conservatives who care about precedent more than personalities. They didn't rush to defend the act. They asked what it meant. And in doing so, they cracked the reflexive shield Trump depends on. This wasn't about ideology anymore. It was about separation of powers. Because if a president can do this once, under pressure, with applause, then the axis tilts permanently. Executive power expands, legislative authority shrinks, and the balance that keeps ambition from turning into command quietly breaks. The fallout didn't stay abstract for long. Domestically, the signal was unmistakable. Confidence wavered. Investments slowed, not because of numbers on a chart, but because trust is a psychological asset, and Trump was burning it in real time. People don't need spreadsheets to feel instability. They feel it when leadership looks impulsive instead of anchored. The political consequences began stacking quietly. Allies hedged, voters questioned, institutions prepared for scenarios they hoped would never be tested. And none of this required coordination. It emerged naturally from uncertainty. Trump tried to frame the resistance as illegitimate. He attacked motives. He mocked process. He painted checks as betrayal. But that framing only deepened the central question now hanging over the presidency itself. If this power grab stands, what limits remain? If this precedent survives, what stops the next escalation? And if the system blinks here, what exactly is the office of the presidency supposed to represent anymore? That question doesn't resolve quickly. It doesn't disappear with headlines. It lingers, embedded in every future decision, every legal challenge, every moment where restraint is tested. Because once the system is forced to defend itself against the president, legitimacy becomes fragile. And when legitimacy cracks, authority doesn't vanish overnight. It erodes slowly, publicly, irreversibly. And the most dangerous part is this. If Trump loses this fight, he calls it sabotage. If Trump wins it, the presidency itself loses something it may never get back. So the system pushes back, not because it wants conflict, but because the alternative is surrender. And that leaves the country standing at a line it never expected to have to draw between power that governs and power that simply takes. That question is now open. This is no longer about Venezuela. This is no longer about one operation, one headline, or one moment of global outrage. This is rules versus power. And that's the point. Let that sink in. Because when Donald Trump seizes a sitting head of state and treats sovereignty like a prop, he isn't just making a foreign policy move. He is testing whether the world still believes in limits. And he is testing whether the United States still believes in its own. Trump cannot tolerate limits. He hates slow, he hates process, he hates restraint. He hates the idea that any institution, international or domestic, can tell him no and mean it. He wants speed. He wants control. He wants outcomes on command. And whenever reality refuses him, he doesn't adjust his expectations. He attacks the barrier. That impulse is not a personality quirk. It is a governing philosophy built on impatience and domination. It treats law as an obstacle, not a framework. It treats allies as tools, not partners. And it treats legitimacy as something you can replace with force, so long as the cameras keep rolling. Here is the warning that people keep trying to avoid saying out loud. If this kind of act is accepted, it becomes precedent. If it becomes precedent, it does not disappear when Donald Trump leaves the stage. If it does not disappear, the next president inherits it like a loaded weapon. And if the next president inherits it, someone will use it again. That chain is not melodrama. It is how power behaves once it discovers a shortcut. No one in politics gives up power voluntarily after they learn they can take it. They justify it. They normalize it. They repeat it. And that is how democratic decay actually happens. It doesn't happen with one dramatic collapse where everyone notices the exact moment the lights went out. It happens when the unacceptable becomes routine. It happens when the outrageous becomes familiar. It happens when people get tired, shrug, and say, well, that's just how it is now. Norms don't vanish overnight. They erode through repetition, through exhaustion, through the slow training of the public to accept the next breach as politics. Trump thrives on that fatigue because fatigue looks like permission. Confusion looks like cover. And chaos creates a fog where accountability can't breathe. But politics is not only ideology, it is also instinct. Voters, whatever their party, reward stability when they can feel it. They punish incompetence when it touches their lives. They don't need a policy memo to understand volatility. They recognize it in prices, in jobs, in uncertainty, in the sense that the ground under them isn't firm anymore. And here's what Donald Trump keeps underestimating. Spectacle is loud, but stability is persuasive. Threats are dramatic, but competence is durable. A strongman performance can dominate a news cycle, but it cannot run a complex society without consequences catching up. That's the problem. A country is not a stage, a presidency is not a stunt, and power is not legitimacy. So what we're watching now is a civilizational choice disguised as a news event. A serious nation built on limits and rules and institutions that can withstand one person's ambition. Or a reality TV state where every boundary is negotiable if the ratings are good, where every norm is optional if the crowd cheers, where force replaces persuasion because persuasion takes too long. And the most honest part is this: it isn't over. The legal fights are only beginning. The diplomatic consequences are still unfolding. The economic aftershocks haven't finished moving from the abstract world of policy into the ordinary world of daily life. The system is pushing back, but it's doing it under pressure, with everyone watching, and with Donald Trump daring it to flinch. So the question isn't whether this was bold. The question is whether the United States is willing to live inside a future where power can seize anything and call it leadership. Because once a country chooses spectacle over governance, it doesn't snap back easily. It slides, and it keeps sliding, and then one day, the rules people thought were permanent are gone without anyone being able to point to the exact moment they disappeared